Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings, and thank you for joining me, Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Herbally Yours brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. Today, I am so happy to have as our guest Dr. Michael Meguid. Dr. Michael is a surgeon and medical researcher. He spent his early childhood in Egypt, Germany, and England, and attended University College Hospital Medical School in London, and successfully completed his medical training and won a scholarship to Boston, where he did a surgical residency at Harvard Medical School and studied human nutrition at MIT. He is founder and editor emeritus of Nutrition, the International Journal of Applied and Basic Nutritional Sciences. And he's written his new book called Roots and Branches, where Dr. Meguid shares his remarkable journey about overcoming early childhood trauma to become a renowned surgeon and research scientist. And you can find out more about Dr. Michael at Michael Meguid, that's MEGUID.com. Thank you so much for joining us today, Doctor.
Thank you for the privilege.
Well, you have, we're going to talk about your book, and which seems to be more about, sort of an internal emotional trauma that you had, and yet it didn't slow you down. You just went ahead and became a top surgeon and medical researcher, which is really speaks to, how people can be resilient through trauma. But I can't let you off the hook about nutrition, because truly that's what brought me to want to bring you on board, because as you may know, this show is called Herbally Yours, because in all my writing and my research, it's always been with a focus on natural and with nutrition. So what led you as a Harvard-trained medical doctor to become interested in nutrition?
That's an interesting question, and it arose from the early days at what was then called Peter and Brigham Hospital. We had burn patients and trauma patients, some trauma patients, and then subsequently at Boston City Hospital, where there were a lot of trauma patients. And the operations themselves to snatch these patients out of the grip of death and bring them back alive was fine. But they did poorly after the operation because they were not being fed. And the case that brought me to go to MIT was I was called one morning at 2 a.m. to Boston City Hospital. My resident told me a man who tried to break into an apartment slipped off the ledge, fell 4 stories and broke his leg, and he has blood in his abdomen. So I said, get him to the OR right away, and I dashed down the Mass Pike and joined them. And this man had a beautiful physique. He was 18 years old, and I never had such a beautiful physique. I aspired to his physique. He had thick neck, muscular arms, muscular legs, and he had a big distended belly, which we all expected to be full of blood. So we crash intubated him, and we opened his belly. I opened his belly with one big slash from the pubis to the xiphoid to the chest bone, expecting masses of blood. The anesthesia was ready with bags of blood to give to this individual, and we found absolutely nothing. And I was surprised, so I went through my exercise, looked at the liver, examined the liver very carefully, the pancreas very carefully, all the organs that can break when you have such a massive deceleration injury. And they were all normal until we recognized that there was some blood coming from his back. And what was happening here was the femur had fractured, and the femur is a very, very bloody bone. And the blood was filling his leg and then trickling up his back and oozing into the abdomen. So our test for blood in the belly had been falsely positive. I closed them up, and the anesthesia team came in, and they took care and fixed his femur. And I said, God, thank you for saving this man's life, because had he had anything major in his belly, he might not do as well. It's just a femur fracture. So we changed services. He changed services from the trauma service to the orthopedic service. And he was, after the operation, lay in the first bed in the ICU. And every day as I went into the ICU to examine my patients, I would see Leroy, and I'd wave to him. And this went on for 30 days. And after 30 days, his bed was empty. So I asked the nurses, where did you send Leroy to? And they said, we didn't transfer him. He died. And I was flabbergasted. How could an 18-year-old kid with all that muscle die? So I scurried down into the basement of Boston City, found his records, and sat down and read what he had eaten. And in fact, he hadn't eaten anything because he couldn't get out of bed because of his femur. He had been given intravenous glucose water. Now, that is the standard of care back in 1970s. 5 liters of intravenous glucose.
Which is, let's just tell our audience, is sugar, basically.
Is sugar, and basically comes to 500 calories. It's like eating 2 candy bars. 2 candy bars, when you have a major incision in the abdomen and a major fracture and tremendous blood loss, will never do. We calculated his energy requirements to be about 3,200 calories a day. Instead, he was getting 500 calories a day. So that was the first time I realized that in this hospital, in a major hospital in Boston, a young man had died because of nutritional neglect. Not neglect, malice neglect, but neglect due to us not knowing any better. That's when I picked up the phone, called the head of MIT nutrition department, and I said, I would like to attend the courses you give to your young people there. May I attend some lectures so I can educate myself? And he said, yes, of course, come on over. And before I knew it, they had signed me up on a graduate program. Now, I had all my basic education in England, so I didn't quite know what I was signing, to be frankly. And they paid for my courses, and they expected me to attend. So every morning between 9 and 12, I attended MIT lectures on nutrition. We had wonderful teachers, wonderful professors. And then in the afternoon, I crossed the bridge, across the Charles River, and went to Boston City Hospital and operated. And in the evening, if there were any emergencies, I'd do the emergencies. And at weekends, I would read all my nutrition notes from MIT. And this went on for 3 years. After year 2, I'd finished all my compulsory courses, and we started a research project. And by year 3, I was out of there. They gave me some degree, which turned out to be a PhD. My thesis was published, and so on. And I used that information at a time when the nutrition industry was beginning to rev up to learn how do we give nutrition to patients who are unable to eat, patients who cannot eat, and patients who do not want to eat. So that we had to develop the various catheters to put into their arms. We had to develop the solutions, make sure they're all compatible. And we developed the standard nutritional support solution now, which is 50% fat and about 14 to 20% amino acids, and the rest is glucose. So that we're giving a balanced nutritional intravenous feed to those patients who are unable to eat, cannot eat, or don't want to eat.
Right. That amino acid is very different than just glucose alone. Now, I am looking at your shelf, even though we don't have video on our show today right here on Herbally Yours. And let me remind you, listeners, that you are listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse. And today, my guest is Dr. Michael Meguid. And we're going to be talking about his new book, which is called Roots and Branches. I see another book there. Do I? Did you write that one also, Doctor?
Yes.
It's about a surgery.
Yes.
What's the name of that book?
That is called Mastering the Knife. So that Roots and Branches is essentially my life and my grandparents' life. I needed to know where my grandparents came from. I needed to know where my parents came from because my father was Egyptian, my mother was German. And so that takes me up to the age of 16. And then Mastering the Knife takes me from 20 to the age of 30, where I learned the skill and the art of being a physician and then becoming a surgeon, and the fantastic training I had initially at Mass General and then at Peterborough Brigham Hospital, Children's Hospital, Boston City Hospital. They all contributed wonderful techniques and surgical skills for my career.
Let's go into Roots and Branches, because what made you feel compelled to write this very in-depth and beautiful book, A Family Saga Like No Other, where you're talking about very personal processes that, you would think might set someone back and not allow them to become, like you are, a revered and brilliant physician and surgeon. So what was your purpose in sharing this very deep and troubling story?
Well, it really starts, I consider it a love story, but it really starts when my parents met in England in 1935. I have all their love letters, and they got married in 1939. And then my father promised my mother they would go back to Egypt, and he promised her that I will bring you back to Europe in order that you can continue your education. And then, of course, the war occurred. And then my mother had a child, my older sister. And then my mother had me. There were lots of sort of things in the way for her to continue education, and she was not a very patient woman. Finally, in 1949, we take a troop ship that was going from India to England. We boarded it in Port Said, and we went to Europe. I was 4 years old, and my sister and I were literally dumped with my German grandparents in cold, devastated post-war Hamburg. I didn't understand German. I didn't speak German. I didn't like their food rationing and their meager foodness, and then the austerity of their guilt culture. And then my mother leaving me left a gaping, howling hole of loneliness and longing.
Well, who did she leave you with? What do you mean leaving
With my
you?
German grandparents.
Oh, okay. So your mother left you there with your grandparents because she was going back to school?
Yes, going back to school. She went back to England with my father, back to school. But as a 4-year-old, you don't know where your parents have disappeared. They've just disappeared. And you don't know when they're coming back. And especially since it's post-war years, with all the rationing and the denazification process and all that, it puts you adopt all the guilt of a nation that had nothing to do with me.
Right, but we could just imagine right now, even with other children that are stranded, let's say even in the United States at the border, in a facility, not with their grandparents, with no way to communicate or even have any clue of where their parents might be. So, even in your situation, it was traumatic for you.
Right. And then when my parents came to collect me 3 years later, they were virtual strangers. My emotional mother became my German grandmother. She was the one who dressed me. She was the one who, in the cold winter days, would tear up newspapers and put them in the kitchen oven to warm me up. She was the one who darned my socks, and she was the one who sewed my buttons on and made sure I was doing well. My German grandmother became really my emotional mother. And the other lady, who was my biological mother and with whom I lived till she passed at 82, was really a fellow passenger in my life. And then we went back to Egypt, and I found that I could no longer speak Arabic. We'd been overseas too long.
Oh, that's interesting.
You know?
For any child that's misplaced, and
Yes.
they, what the whole language development at that young age would actually interfere.
Right. And then my father set up tutors to teach me Arabic, and I went to an Arabic school. I was walking around knowing nothing, didn't know anything. And my father was a professor of Arabic at Cairo University, and he was very ashamed that his very own son couldn't speak Arabic. And he really didn't think I was making an effort. And, an 11-year-old boy wants to play with his friends, and I had model airplanes and so on and so forth. Learning Arabic was a really, really bad event. And so I did poorly on one of the school exams. I failed it, actually. And he, at the time, was in Beirut overseas working for UNESCO, and he wrote me a letter, and he said, if you had no father, you'd not only make an effort, and you'd have to struggle like I had to as I grew up, and then your life would be different. Consequently, you might do better in school and in your life. And I got this letter. I was 11. I got this letter and I read it. And there was nothing like Love Daddy or any of that. He died the next day.
Oh, no.
So I have lived with this monkey on my back all my life. And there was a tip-off in his letter, like I had to as I grew up. And so I decided to delve into that. What did he mean by that? And it takes us back to Upper Egypt, which is about 200 miles south of Cairo. I went back there to where the family stems from, to the village of Ben Haram in Upper Egypt. And I saw my various relatives, and I heard then the story that my father's mother, my father was the firstborn child, and a firstborn male in that society is a blessing because he's going to work the land, he's going to inherit, and he's going to do all these things. And he and his brothers, he had 2 more brothers, were playing in a rather dangerous situation. His mother went to try and get them out of that dangerous situation, and an accident happened that broke her spine. And so over a period of a year, my father saw his mother gradually die. And after the usual 1 year of mourning, my grandfather remarried a 16-year-old girl, which is the tradition. Remember, life expectancy was only 40.
So I just want to throw this out. My grandfather, also, my great-grandfather actually, his first wife passed away after having 12 children in childbirth, and she had her cousin staying there to help with all those children. And then when she passed away, she requested that he marry her very young cousin. So it was not that unusual.
Yes. And this Nazifa is her name, bore my grandfather a son. So she expelled my father at the age of 6 to try and prevent there being an heir struggle. She expelled my father at age 6. My grandfather, I read his letter. He put my father on a train to Cairo with the expectation that my father would get some schooling there by a distant aunt. Instead, the distant aunt thought this is an opportunity to make some money, and she sold him into servitude to a laborer. And my father, after several months, escaped from this situation and went to Al-Azhar Madrasa. These are the religious schools which take in orphans, and they learn the Quran by rote, really. And my father realized that progression in life depended upon education. So he left after he finished the Al-Azhar schooling. He joined a regular school, graduated, became a school teacher, then applied to the British Council for a scholarship to go to England and to become a teacher trainer. And he actually left Egypt to go to England. And that was in 1930. 5 years later, he met my mother there. And so I had to know, how could my father have agreed to have just abandoning me with a German grandmother at age 4? And I realized in reading and putting all this together that to him it wasn't unusual. Therefore, his letter that, like I had to as I grew up, you'll have to struggle like I had to as I grew up, I heard it over and over in my brain. And I realized that is what he went through. And I just needed to do the same. And this is what drove me to become a surgeon, become a scientist. We had a research lab funded by National Institutes of Health. And the one problem that my cancer patients had was they lost their appetite. And I thought, if only we could stimulate the appetite in such a way that they eat whatever they like, then it would speed up healing. Instead of which I had developed a lot, together with many other people, of nutritional and gastric feeding formulas to help these patients.
Yeah, that does bring us back to nutrition, certainly. And that's some research I'm currently involved in, particularly with cannabis, because that has been found to be very useful in terms of working against the cachexia that develops in cancer due to depressed appetite and nausea.
Yes, and we did use a form of cannabis, a pill that we prescribed to patients. And we also used steroids. We gave them androgen steroids to patients, and that helped them stimulate their appetite and helped them put on muscle again to get them off respirators.
Well, in your book, Dr. Meguid, Roots and Branches, when you're looking at the table of contents, there's some very, very interesting chapter names, and really your writing is very supportive of others who have struggled, with various kinds of psychological and physical traumas in early life, and then very inspirational how you rose above it. Like, beautiful things, the Egyptian clan, the inexorable German pole, the scorpion sting, family life, really, really interesting chapters that you are kind of sharing here as your biography of who you are and what really supported you in your development, intellectually and professionally.
Thank you for saying that. Yes, I'm very proud of the book. It's a journey that helped me go into the past and helped me understand who I am. The early childhood trauma has now been recognized to lead to something that is called complex PTSD. And complex PTSD, and I needed to understand that because I was feeling that I was suffering from this, but I did not understand why. Why was this hanging over my head? It leads. We estimate that about 25% of Americans grow up with dysfunctional alcoholic homes. 1 in 5 women are molested. 1 in 9 boys are molested. There is the PTSD of war and starvation. In my case, it was abandonment at an early age where the brain is being formed. And the consequences of that is that you develop chronic anxiety, you develop traits of not trusting other people, you do not know boundaries, you have a whole number of problems that arise as a consequence of being sustaining this brain insult as a child.
Yeah, but you overcame it. So we're almost at the end here. We have to sign off shortly. But what would you say allowed you to raise above such a traumatic, going through the war, going through multiple moves, being separated from your parents, to then be supported enough to become really, the person that you are today as Dr. Michael Meguid, and, all the top schools. We're talking Harvard, we're talking, PhDs and MDs. These are big things to accomplish.
Yes, I had a very emotionally supportive grandmother as I was growing up, who, as I said, became my mother person. And then when I married, I had a very supportive wife.
Oh, all women. This is nice to hear.
Yes, yeah. Yes, all women, you bet. And I had a very supportive and understanding wife. The fact that she was also a physician helped her understand me. And then the ability of writing my memoirs, which is a series of 4 books, of which Roots and Branches is the first. Making the Cut, Mastering the Knife is the second. The third is called Surgeon and Lovers, and that is about to come out in June. And the fourth, we haven't quite found a title for that yet. So a title and a cover. So that's probably...
Okay, well, so that's a project you're still working on.
Indeed.
So we're going to, sign off here because our time is coming to an end, but I wanted to thank you so much for such inspiration. Check out the book, Roots and Branches, written by Dr. Michael Meguid. And of course, you can always find our show after listening to it today on our archive.
Thank you for the privilege, Ellen. It's wonderful.
And I would like to thank you for tuning into Herbally Yours, produced in the studios, or nowadays nearby, of 90.3 WHPC, Nassau Community College in Garden City, New York. For further information, please send us an email at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamai at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us again next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.